I'd also like to acknowledge the announcement that was made by Dr. Brown. I'm sorry he's not here to hear my speech, but also, he's got far more important things to do, really, hasn't he? But I did want to publicly acknowledge what his contribution has been, not just this morning. I want to actually acknowledge a couple of really important things the Greens have done in support of initiatives and policies that ACOSS have been pushing for very strongly and stridently in recent times. Most notably, I have to say that it was the intervention of the Greens that kept the National Rental Affordability Scheme, the NRAS scheme, and the numbers for the NRAS scheme intact. As many of you would know, it was at risk. It was one of those policies and commitments that were at risk as a result of the flood levy that was being imposed and the expenditure from the federal government, and they were looking to make cuts. NRAS was in the firing line, and I have to say, as a result of some very effective lobbying by this sector, Shelter, ACOSS, St Vinny's, but many others too, and the intervention of the Greens, we were able to actually retain those commitments to the NRAS numbers that the government had previously made. And the other area I just want to briefly mention in relation to the Greens' stance, which is certainly in line with where ACOSS have been pushing for the last 2 to 3 years, is in opposition to compulsory income management. I want to make some mention of that a little bit later on in my speech, but I have to say that the Greens have probably been the only party that have actually been in concert with ACOSS, and many of you, most of you, who have been trying to push back compulsory income management and its spread across Australia. I want to talk a little bit more about that later. But I have to thank the Senator too for reigniting the debate about taxation and the distribution of our wealth. It's the heartland of ACOSS policy, and it's an area that is in need of significant attention. Okay. As I stand here, I have to say I think of my predecessors who have come and addressed ACOSS conferences, or congresses as they used to be called in the past, and wondered what they might have been thinking they were here. Well, there's probably two things that I think audiences would have been guaranteed of in the past when ACOSS presidents got up here on the podium. One is that they would have spoken much more eloquently than the current president, knowing many of those past presidents. But secondly, I suspect they would have actually constructed what they had to say in the times of the day. They would have looked at the importance of the times and the need for action and constructed what they had to say. And clearly, what we do and what we say is constructed and, in many senses, in response to the political and economic times that we live in. And there's been times in the past, no doubt, when ACOSS presidents have got here and things have been pretty gloomy. And in many senses, much of our effort would have been put on trying to push back some fairly punitive public policy from the federal government of the times. I don't know how you currently view the existing times, both politically and economically in Australia. I mean, they're fairly turbulent politically, aren't they? And economically, I don't think we're clearly out of the woods yet in terms of where we would have been looking a couple of years ago with the economic crisis that was facing not just us but the whole world. We are seeing some really positive moves on things like climate change. It's a hard, long road, and as only the Senator and the Greens know, in terms of ensuring that we finally get some policy traction on this issue and some real change. We haven't really got the debates about the tax and transfer system, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment too, in terms of the ACOSS position on tax and transfers. But I have to say, at least we're actually getting, I think, some more equitable distribution of income. And if you look at even the way that the flood levy has been proposed and will be implemented, I have to say, at the very least, it wasn't a flat tax rate. It was an effort to try and ensure that there was some equity in the way that it was actually being applied across Australia. So those who were most able to pay, paid the most in relation to that flood levy. Now, we're not going to actually see, I think, an overhaul of our taxation system by the impositions of levies of any description. But nonetheless, I have to say, it's pleasing to note that at least when the government has acted on those things, it's tried to bring some equity into the debate about how to actually take money in the form of taxations or levies. Okay, so what times are we in? Well, in some ways, I think we've had the year of the natural disaster, haven't we? That's probably been the thing that has occupied much of the public space and public thought in the last 12 months or so. It wasn't that long ago. I know we've been talking a lot in recent times quite clearly about the impacts of floods right across much of Australia, certainly in northern Australia, but also here in Victoria. It wasn't that long ago, of course, we would have been talking about the aftermath of the bushfires here in Victoria. And there's no doubt that those disasters have had a profound impact on communities and the nation as a whole. And many of the organisations, many of you that are here today, have very much been at the forefront of responding to those crises in really practical ways on the front line, providing essential services and relief to people who are in crisis, who are really struggling with losses of family, losses of property, but also, most importantly, in rebuilding communities and the lives of people and families that goes on not just for weeks and months, but for many years afterwards. And in many senses, I think that those natural disasters, in a sense, highlight one of the really fundamental roles that community service organisations, those sitting in this room today, play in our community. And that role goes beyond the provision of those immediate services. They're really fundamental and they're important, but our role is much more fundamental than that. We're very much part of building a civil society. We're about building social cohesion and networks of mutual support. And these are really, I think, unheralded assets of our sector. They are what the Productivity Commission referred to in a, I think, somewhat unkind way as the spillover effects of community services. Much of the Productivity Commission report of last year focused on the role of not-for-profits in terms of service provision, those essential services not just in times of crisis, but those things that people do each and every day in responding to issues like homelessness or people who are experiencing poverty, family crisis and the like. And they're really essential parts of what our system, what our services, what our organisations do, but they're not at the heart of what the not-for-profit sector is about. We are very much part of enabling communities to engage in political life and in economic life. And I think it's important that we keep that at the heart and the forefront of everything that we actually do and are about. And I have to say it's because of the importance and that role that we play in the community that ACOSS was so disappointed that we weren't actually involved, as were big businesses, as were other interests, in discussions about the rebuilding post the floods. We had a lot to say, we had a lot to contribute about how to ensure that there could be a fair response, a response that enabled sufficient revenues to be sourced from the Australian community and to be redistributed to those people in need. We've been working on those policies year in, year out, and I know that my predecessors would have talked about those policies in previous years too, about our tax and transfer system, about economic development, about income support issues and about employment and employment growth. These are the heartland issues for ACOSS, and they'll continue to be core elements of the ACOSS agenda. We won't jettison those other things that we do in relation to frontline services, but issues to do with tax and transfer is very much at the core of what we're about.